I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Foley Institute here at WSU, and on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to, this is our last event of the semester, but we'll start up again in January. But we're fortunate to have with us our local representatives. They're very gracious every year to come and give us a little preview of the legislative session, and we really appreciate them taking the time to come visit us here on campus. Representative Schmidt could not be with us today, but we have with us Senator Mark Schoesler. He's represented the 9th Legislative District here in Washington for 24 years. He's currently the Senate Minority Leader. Before serving in the Senate, he served 12 years in the State House. He serves on the Ways and Means Committee and Rules Committee. He and his wife, Ginger, have 2 children and live in Ritzville, located in Adams County. We also have with us Representative Mary Dye. She's a longtime resident of Pomeroy and received a bachelor's degree from the University of Idaho. Representative Dye was appointed first to the state legislature in May of 2015. She was just recently won re-election to her seat this last month. She serves on the Appropriations, on the Capital Budget, and on the Environment Committees. Representative Dye operates a wheat farm with her husband. Representative Dye and her husband have 3 children. So I think we're going to hear first from Senator Schoesler and then from Representative Dye, and then we'll open up for just some give and take and some Q&A. So.
Well, thank you. It may be 24 years to you, but it's been 26.
Oh, 27. I lose track.
Somewhere they got to update those bios, I guess. No, it's good to be here. I look around the room and every year there's more familiar faces. The longer you serve in the district, you learn people, and I see a lot of people in a lot of different capacities I've worked with in this room. So as we head into this, I think I've seen every combination of the legislature now. Majorities, minorities, ties, majority leader, like. And we go into this session as more of a minority than I would like. I'm disappointed a couple of races didn't turn out. I expected a very close majority. Instead it's a little wider than my preference would be. But we look at this, we'll say that the glass is half full. We left Olympia last spring with a budget that was balanced for 4 years. Albeit not the way I would like it balanced. It did meet the legal 4-year balanced budget requirement, which is an excellent protection against peaks and valleys in our state's budget in areas. It's surprising to me that the administration, or OFM, is talking about $1.5 billion deficit. Now, I don't know quite how you get to $1.5 billion deficit from a budget that was planned for 4 years of balance with the expenses I know that are definitely out there. So that'll be interesting when the governor's budget comes out a week from tomorrow. We'll see. I would expect something very similar to his previous budgets, quite possibly book 1 and then book 2, much like before. If we look at the majority and minority priorities, they line up very, very similar in major policy areas. I think all 4 caucuses have an interest in housing, and that's broad-based in homelessness, affordability, and specialized, in some cases, developmental disabilities. Clearly we'll see an interest there. A lot of interest in mental health. In fact, if you look at mental health in the previous biennium, had it not been McClary, the enhancements in mental health would have called it the mental health session. With the events at Western State Hospital, it's clearly going to be there, and there's interest within the community. Opioids, I think, fit into both of those to some degree. We'll see those. I think the difference is how you get there. I think all 4 caucuses share similar interests, but the means to get there are where the differences lie, in my opinion, based on time and experience, is where you go. So that's just a snapshot of where we're at, and I'll turn it over to Representative Dyer.
Thank you. So we just completed the first part of the week on Assembly Days for the House, and we got to see the lay of the land for the first time as to what our committees are going to look like, and some significant changes have occurred. And I'd just like to highlight some of those. I've served on the Environment Committee, and so now we're moving the energy policy from Tech Committee over to the Environment Committee. And that's significant because the governor will be running a number of policies relating to carbon and climate change. Initially, we thought they might even have a specific climate change committee. That didn't bear out. They decided on just a combined energy and environment committee. That policy, I think, is, again, just like the senator suggested, you know, when you look at it, energy policy is critical, especially to our side of the state where we have energy intensive, export dependent economy. And so I think that we're going to have a menu of solutions that'll go on the table, and hopefully we can illustrate, you know, that you can have environmentally friendly energy policy without having such a negative effect on the economy of critical industries in our part of the state, which would be our agricultural and shipping. So I'm hopeful that we will come to some kind of common ground on, or a middle ground on that policy. Of course, in environment, we've got the ORCA task force and saving our Snake River dams juxtaposed. So I think those issues will also be on the table, and it'll be interesting to see how we thread the needle on that. I think there is a strong nexus in energy policy when our 85% of our energy is produced by carbon-free hydro, and so I think that we have to find the balance with those issues, and so that's our challenge in that committee. On the tech side of it, which really I think poses a lot of opportunities for this university in particular, is the governor wants to do a large amount of broadband infrastructure work, and so we'll be spearheading a number of initiatives on broadband in rural and underserved communities. There's a number of proposals on the table to get that out to rural communities. I think that WSU and Whitman County have been leaders in that space in showing free market alternatives to getting broadband, and I'm really pleased to see how much has been done since the passage of the broadband bill that we passed this last spring. And I think that our next steps also need to be on cybersecurity and really looking at the state's computer systems to see if we truly are safe and have implemented best practices in that space. So I think we're going to be doing a lot of evaluation on cybersecurity and in state government. And so that's going to be a focus as well. And so I think it's going to be an exciting session, really. A lot to look at. On the budget committees, same. We had a first peek at the operating budget and the revenue projections. The revenue projections are strong in the 4-year outlook. There's a bit of a bow wave on the McCleary, which is K through 12 education funding. I think that'll have to be adjusted at some level. And then whatever the creative legislators come forward with in their legislative proposals to spend money, that's going to be the key piece. So it's amazing how 98 people can have a million different ways to spend your hard-earned dollars. So hopefully we can keep some common sense and discipline on that impulse. So that's basically where I'm at.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. So we've got about 40 minutes or so for Q&A. I'll start us off with some topics of interest to our students here. One is What do you think's the possibility for fully funding the state need grants and also doing something on student loan interest rates?
Well, I think the need grant is a long and steady journey. You're going to chip away at it incrementally. If you remember, though, the single best thing we did to the need grant was when we reduced the need. We froze tuition and eliminated the entire $500 million unfunded liability in GET. And we cut it by 15% here and then linked it to average wage growth. So I think now we've got a stable tuition that we're not chasing our tail. And I think we'll chip away at it. I think the financing portion is very fluid yet. Who should do it and how, I think, is yet to be settled.
Okay. So questions? Yeah, back here.
Yeah, I just have a question. So I'm a graduate student here at this school, obviously. And I work over in a building that is currently condemned because there has not been enough money coming in from the state in order to fix the building or build a new one. If you're not aware of it, it's called Heald. It's right down the hill.
Sorry, I
here.
didn't hear the name.
Heald. It's right down the hill here.
And what program is housed in it?
Biology.
Okay.
So it's currently a condemned building, not assigned for research use, but I do research in that building and have to pay a fee to work in that building to do my research in a condemned building. So as far as, exercising this restraint on spending money, I would like to hear from both of you actually what can you do and what do you plan on doing in order to fix this issue?
So last year in capital budget, WSU was the big winner. Go Cougs against the Huskies. I think we took the majority of capital budget, getting both the plant science building and the animal science, the Paul Allen Center appropriation. There's going to be a continued appropriation this year because we kind of split the half and half on the Paul Allen Center. And so that will be one of the asks in the capital budget going forward from the university. We'll see how that plays this year. I don't know. Haven't heard any word about the university pieces in the governor's budget. But I'm really excited about the new plant science building. I think that hopefully the new lab space, I don't know how many of the biology programs will be feeding into either of those two new facilities. In terms of condemned buildings, the leadership here hasn't approached capital budget on your building at all. And so I think it has to come from the university to draw to the attention of the university and their prioritization schedule. And I really haven't seen that schedule in terms of long-term assets that need to be upgraded. I've only been working on the two buildings, and we were successful in achieving capital budget funds for both of those at higher levels than we anticipated because there was extraordinary revenues last year that we were able to deploy into that.
I would say it's a little bit shorter, but generally capital budget, the House and Senate Ways and Means rely on our university's priority list, and we generally don't mess with it much. And I think the last time we saw a radical shift, some people thought WSU had gamed the system, and there was retribution by the governor and by the legislature when they thought it was trying to be gamed. We generally try to follow it, that the regents and the administration puts together a plan, and we don't try to micromanage it. So we rely heavily on that input.
Cornell.
Yeah, over here.
I'm Deborah Carlson, Capital Budget Director.
Oh, great.
The building he's speaking to is on our list for pre-design in the 2019-21 request. It was also in the range last biennium and did not get funded. So it is a 6-year process. If we get funding, it's pre-design, design, construction, but it is on the list, and we hope for funding this year.
And just to
Thank you. I think it's interesting.
It's going to be replaced
It's a replacement.
on site.
just to be clear, it is so condemned that we don't even have clean drinking water in the building.
Right.
So
Well,
please keep it in
There's
mind.
there's two things you can do in that situation. Now, to get a capital budget project, you need to be referenced in a minimum of one of the 3 budgets, preferably 2. The governor's will be out next week. That's, if it's in that one, it's a good start. The other thing that we do have some flexibility in is combining pre-design and design if there is a critical need. And it's really a somewhat inefficient system with pre-design, design, and construction in 3 bienniums. And unfortunately, we probably put too much pre-design into budgets because everybody wants to feel like they're in the queue. But I think that, appreciate having somebody here that understands capital.
Yeah, that's great, thanks.
Okay, yeah, back here.
My name is Noel Best, formerly incarcerated graduate student here at WSU. Mary came out to the Foley event that we had last year after Ban the Box in higher education was passed. And I know that both of you didn't vote for Ban the Box in higher education, and I realize that sometimes that's along party lines and whatnot, but I guess my question is, if that's not the answer, if Ban the Box in higher education or providing access or removing barriers for people coming out of prison is not the answer, what is the answer in your eyes? Or could you explain that vote or talk a little bit about what you see as a good answer for pulling people or raising people kind of after they've been released from prison?
First of all, your presentation at the Foley Institute was the highlight of my year. That was a really inspiring piece, and we know all of us, education lifts up everybody. It's the great opportunity maker, right? And you really took advantage of that. Man, it was an impressive program. So as far as policy ideas, I think that we, as a body, we kind of lock onto certain policy paradigms, and we stop thinking about the creativity that policymakers can bring to problems. And so, I mean, I think we need to parse out the concerns that were in the Ban the Box issue, because it was kind of a broad sweep, 8-inch brush approach, so that, there was kind of no transparency whatsoever. And I know that while you went through your experiences while you were incarcerated, there was a real a menu of attitudes of people. And some people may never embrace the opportunities that you did. And so I think for the public, I think that we need to really parse out and have more thoughtful conversations with you so that you can help us with a policy that is more granular than just the broad sweep that the Ban the Box was. It was just a one-size-fits-all policy with a great title. Go ahead.
I think Representative summed it up pretty well. I think there's an underlying concern for safety, real or perceived. The other thing that I don't think we have done as well, we worked on it over 20 years ago, and that's better utilizing the education programs within our institutions, that there's a push or incentive to use those before people come out and accelerate the path. In 1995, we actually set public policy to try and get to a minimum level of education while incarcerated, so that when you were released, you were somewhat prepared for the real world through incentives. So we need to do it better while we're there, and we have to decide what is the real or other threats on the outside that people get concerned about their own safety.
Yeah, over here.
Yeah, so I've got a couple questions. The first question I have, representative from Spokane Valley, Matt Shea, he just won re-election, and he published a Christian manifesto talking about building a holy army and built rules for war, calling for the killing of all males that do not follow his Christian rules. Obviously, he is a member of the House Republican Caucus, just won re-election. I was wondering if you could touch on that, and then I also wanted to kind of get your opinions as well on Matt Manweller, who was also re-elected to State House over in Central Washington after his time as a Central Washington professor and preying on WSU students using his position of power to gain sexual favors. So I was wondering if you two could just kind of elaborate your stance on those two different scenarios there.
Well, I think
You want to split them up?
well, first of all, let's get it right. It was not WSU students. It was
Yes,
CWU.
that's-
I think WSU students were safe.
Right.
I think I think the voters in the Spokane Valley decided, the House leadership elections decided their fate. Representative Manueller has announced he's going to resign before the session, and the appointment process will proceed. So I think the system there seems to be working. The outrage, concerns seem to be working themselves out
So,
in that district anyway. I'm not, obviously the voters spoke in the fourth.
right, and since I'm a member of the caucus, I kind of can give you some perceptions of mine, observations maybe. So on the Rep. Shea's writings, I asked him about that because I equally was concerned. What I read in the paper was basically my source of knowledge. And he said that he was working in a veterans program for veterans returning with post-traumatic stress disorder. And his Bible study was just to help veterans not feel like they had a dissonance between their experiences in war and coming back into the civilian society. And he was showing in the Bible some of the scriptural doctrine of just wars. And if anybody's read the Old Testament, I think that none of us can, I can't really put a big cohesive thought process on war. I think it's interesting that he did try to bring some of the scriptures on war to try and assist recovering veterans to feel better about their experiences and that they were fighting for a just cause. And that's basically what the document was for. How it got portrayed in the media certainly drew a world of concern, and so I don't know, there must be some truth in between those two views, and I don't know what it is. That's just my observation. And then in terms of Manueller, I think it draws the broader question because not only Manueller, but many, right now I serve on the Women's Commission, and both the Women's Commission and the Human Rights Commission were mandated to draw up some sexual harassment policies, and I've just seen the first draft of the Human Rights Commission, and we're in the process of submitting our responses to that to the Women's Commission. And I think that we need to have also, again, to find the balance between due process and rule of law and controlling some of the behaviors that are damaging in both the school and the workplace. So I think as we move forward, I would really encourage you to reach out to me with your ideas and thoughts on that, because it right now we're just putting all our ideas up on a massive whiteboard and trying to put together a policy that really works for students and employers and employees across the state to protect people that are working in our environments here, to be much more thoughtful about how we treat each other with consideration and decorum, and to put psych words on behaviors that are totally unacceptable in the workplace and in the school environment.
Can I just follow up on Matt Shea for a minute? This isn't the first incident involving, it was controversial.
Very controversial. There's
So-
no doubt about it.
So he was involved in the Malheur standoff, he was involved in the Bundy, standoff.
He seems to like those issues.
Yeah, so but he was not reelected as caucus chair. Was that a signal that the caucus doesn't approve of some of his behavior?
No, I think that a couple of things we in the caucus, I think it was just time to get some new faces in leadership and give other people opportunities to serve. That's one. The other is in terms of overall, in terms of the way Shea struggled with his messaging, and he's so passionate about the groups that he's helping that I think he gets kind of myopic about the broader implications. And so I think that we really want to show that as a party, as a caucus, as elected people, that we have a broader reach, that we aren't a narrow portion of the party. I know I'm having difficulty explaining that, but you know, it's just, to me, I think that we wanted some new faces in leadership. We had some good leadership in the person that replaced Matt Shea. He was a whip before, and he wanted another opportunity, so he's going to be great. And then we brought in Gina McCabe, and she replaced in the appointed position for Joe Schmidt. And we have Jacqueline Maycomber also sitting up front with us. Just a very dynamic, outgoing woman with a lot of, I don't know, she's just got a lot of chutzpah, admirable qualities. I think we have a really good team. It's going to be unifying for our caucus to have that leadership team in place. I think they'll play well together. And I'm really excited about our leadership team, really. In terms of Matt, I just think he just didn't carry the majority. If the vote was close, he just didn't. I think we just wanted to have new faces, new opportunities for our members, our continuing members to serve in leadership.
Good. Yeah, in the back here.
All right. My question is in regards to something you said earlier about spreading internet connections to more rural areas and your free market solutions and such. Recently in California, they had a violation of net neutrality where Comcast raised the price of firefighters fighting forest fires by 300%. So I'm wondering, will there be any regulations to protect us, the consumers, from corporate abuse in that front?
Right, and I think that it's understanding how the service and who pays for what, right? And so in terms of the firefighting, they had to bring in remote rigs, which are very expensive to deploy. They had to do a lot of technology to get the emergency communications up and running quickly to respond at that emergency level. And that's very costly. So basically what you have is you have the pipe, that's the fixed fiber in the ground, or that's the delivery system. That's one piece of it. You have the people that put the electronics on that pipe to provide content. So if you imagine a hose, it can be big or small, and then you imagine the content that the consumers demand. So I imagine it as a dozen donuts. So right now, Netflix is consuming about 35% of the entire capacity within the pipe. So what net neutrality says is that if you have a third of your box is maple bars, and then a couple of chocolate sprinkles, and maybe 3 curlers, and you know what I'm saying? So what they're saying is that the one single pink frosted is not, gets to pay the exact same amount for the pipe space as the 35%, which is the Netflix. Well, what happens is that there's not enough money in the system to expand the pipe. And so what net neutrality, by removing that regulation, the 35% wants to expand market share, maybe it'll get 40% of the box. They'll be able to pay sufficient to expand the pipe and have more access to the consumers. So the consumer in reality was being constricted by a regulation that limited the capital flowing into the building of the pipe. That's why net neutrality was hurting rural communities, because then they had to go to higher density populations in order to serve and get a return on investment. And our less dense populations didn't have the capital to even build a small pipe out to us. And it was creating these inequities across our culture. And now we're very, very dependent on that infrastructure. If you want to be successful in society, you have to have access. And so by removing net neutrality, it would allow capital to flow into the system, and we would have more access at a lower return on investment for the pipe. So that's basically the lay. When you have fires that disrupt the thing, and it's interesting that became an issue, and I think that's something that the commissioner and I need to discuss, because those are very expensive responses. Like Houston is a very expensive response. We do have emergency truck systems that come and deploy portable fixed wireless to meet the need, but that has to be met somewhere, and the person that pays it is not the end user, but rather the company that is putting the content on the fiber or the content on the wireless. So I think that we need to continue to have conversations so that the broader public has an understanding of how the system works and why it's beneficial to have competition and have more capital flow into be the infrastructure. Go ahead.
On that subject, do we need to have corporations installing like cables into all houses? There is the alternative of installing mesh nets, which would basically in Pullman, like we just put up one like radio tower and we'll provide
Right.
Wi-Fi to everyone, you know, public free Wi-Fi to everyone in like town. So you know, it's just one like,
Right.
mesh net
And
tower
I'm kind
versus
of
like installing. having
I'm kind of
corporations
excited
install.
for Pullman because I think that we're going to be able to thicken up the signal on that, hopefully, and really encouraging the campus here to really partner up, and maybe we can be one of the first 5G cities in the state.
But what I'm saying is we don't need to have like a corporation like providing like a cable to every house in like
Not
town. We
necessarily,
can, like, provide
no.
public Wi-Fi to everyone, and it would be much cheaper.
But certainly it would benefit our Main Street, our brick and mortar, to have fixed fiber to the premise, and then do fixed wireless, or like you said, a mesh net outside of that.
Nick?
I just came back from a National Institute on Civil Discourse conference at Ohio State University, and a lot of legislators from other states are saying that their legislative process is broken, that the paralysis from Washington D.C. has penetrated Wisconsin and their states and blah, blah, blah. So how would you describe the state of Washington's legislative process? Is it able to get to bipartisan problem solving? Is it able to maintain the rules and norms you were talking about, civility and comity, or is it going in a worse direction?
I give us a good grade on
I
civility.
would say yes and no,
Yes
Nick.
and no.
And no.
Well,
It was
let-
better when he was a majority.
So I know this is good now.
Well, no, let me explain. For one thing, we do not have the coverage of the legislature by the press we did when I started. And the press corps in Olympia is content to sit in the press house and watch on TVW and not fill the press tables in the front corner or physically attend. So they don't see what's going on. They don't talk to people to the level that we did earlier in my career, that we didn't rely on our news on the left or the right. The other thing that can change is who the presiding officer is and how they treat the minority or others. Lieutenant Governor Habib does not have the temperament that Brad Owen did presiding. He actually told one of my members, "I'm not going to call on you because you're new," in a debate. So the presiding officer has that tone and tenor. So yes, there's things that are better, some things are no. Just a few years ago, we passed a transportation package with a 2/3 vote. That's unheard of. On the other hand, we had our first party line budget since 2010. So there's something lost when the budget is party line hard in both bodies. I think you saw that in the McCleary portion of the budget this past year. So, Nick, I'm saying yes and I'm saying no, and that's from somebody that's been
Going
there.
both ways.
I've seen it work really well recently. Sadly, Senator Nelson and I got along better in the final 5 weeks of her time as majority leader than we did the previous 5 years. So, yes and no.
How about the House?
So, about the House, well, I think that, it was a different environment because people were very enthusiastic about getting their policies through when they had majorities in all three. There was, the House is an exuberant body and very emotional. But I did have a really neat conversation with the president of Evergreen yesterday when I was over in Olympia. And we talked about civility on campus, because as you're well aware,
Oh, yes.
Evergreen had a big dust up, right? And so we talked about the protest culture and some of the, just some of the fears of criminality and just disobedience and disrespect. And I suggested that, you know, maybe we need to have that conversation about how civil discourse occurs and teach some of those skill sets in the school itself, and talk about civility from the time the students enter campus, and talk about rhetoric and some of the rules of how our body politic functions with civil discourse. And he was very pro on that idea. And so I think we're going to continue to have those conversations. Foley Center is a great example of teaching and exhibiting civil discourse, and that's, I think that you have a great role to play in that conversation.
We try. Let's go back to David here, and then the same lady over here.
Thank you both so much for being here today. Really appreciate it. Senator, my question was regards to your opening comments. You mentioned homelessness, and as a Seattle native, that's really an important issue for us. It's becoming more and more crisis every week. And my question is, what are the similarities and differences between the Republican and Democrat caucuses, and how to approach this issue? And what would you guys propose to address that?
Thank you. You know, I think the important thing is, when you say no to ideas, you have to lead with better ideas. And I think what we have seen is that homelessness in Seattle spends double per capita that Spokane does. So something would tell you that system isn't working real well. And so we have to look at how we deliver it. And the one thing that cures high prices is high prices from economics. And how do we increase the supply to hold the line on cost? So we look at condominium liability. We're not building condominiums in many places because the liability has scared investors and developers away. We have to look at tiny houses. Is that the best place in some areas? Perhaps. Do we look at, we used to call them mother-in-law apartments when I came to Olympia, now it's ancillary dwellings. We look at that. We look at the growth management. The Growth Management Act was passed in 1990. It's not the 10 Commandments. It can be amended from time to time. So we look at market solutions, new ideas, innovation, because clearly when rents start at $1,000 or $1,500 for bad facilities, you're going to have some homelessness. And we look at what the charitable nonprofits are doing, that we have vacant beds in many of those institutions. So there's no one silver bullet, it's comprehensive, but we believe there are solutions besides just increasing the housing budget.
Okay, yeah, over here.
Yeah, I was just wondering what your reasons were for voting against House Bill 1506, which would have updated the state's Equal Pay Act and to reflect the current equal status of workers in Washington.
Thank you. I voted for it. I voted for the package the first time through, and the final bill changed the options for litigation, increasing the opportunities for even more litigation, and I decided that was just too much. That it's already illegal to discriminate on federal law, but when you give the litigators yet a second bite of the apple, that they took it too far.
Basically, it was similar, same arguments, that it was a trial attorney's retirement package. And so we weren't really, it wasn't really addressing the needs of workplace fairness. And there's a large body of federal law that's been tested, and it felt like the policy wasn't, really correct.
You know, the quote's going to be, I voted for it before I voted against it.
You know, I thought of that, but I think it's a great quote that haunted a presidential candidate.
Exactly.
But I think it's important to talk about In a vote you take, I voted for, from my first year in the House, I voted for some things on the first run through, and on final passage there were substantive differences that you have to be able to explain at the end of the day.
Okay, Matt?
I'd like to follow up on Nick's point. Stuart Elway came and gave an excellent talk here at Foley a few months ago about the political divide in the state, and his message, at least what I took away from his message, was that the divide between the two parties is also a divide between rural and urban. And the extent to which rural and urban interests see themselves more and more opposed to each other. And as a former faculty rep down there, but also as a rural sociologist, this worries me a lot. Do you two have any thoughts on that, and what steps, what kind of leadership is needed to sort of start to bridge that divide?
I have a couple of thoughts, and I'm glad that you can be a resource to us from your insights. But so I was looking at the population data for the most recent year, 2017, and virtually in the greater metropolitan Seattle area, which would be Seattle, Tacoma, and Bellevue, it is exactly 1/2 of the state's population. So the remainder of the state, and I really do believe that that greater metropolitan Seattle is the urban, and the remainder, the west side and east side counties reflect a rural, and you'll see that in the voting choices as well. So I mean, I look at some of the policies, and they do have significant impact on the communities that are natural resource dependent economies that have significantly lower median wages, and you just look at, you know, I'm really curious, deeply curious as to how urbanization affects attitudes, the social construct that people, the values, the traditions, and where we come to those divergences. But more importantly, I think that I've given a lot of thought as we were moving into this session as to what the theme should be. And I really believe that there's a couple of themes, but my theme is going to be, let's not hurt each other. If the policy is going to hurt one group against another, or pit one group against another, that we should revisit the policy and try and craft something that is less harmful. And so that, you know, because these policies can have a lot of externalities that can have negative unintended consequences for entire sectors of the state. And so an example would be Grace Harbor, deeply economically depressed, large percentage of unemployment and very low median wages. We passed a policy to protect the marbled murrelet, which removed $800 million of timber resources from the economy in that community, a community that's been really hurt by a lot of environmental policy over the years. And so my question is, could there have been a middle ground that maybe would have allowed some more thoughtful management of both the bird and the forest? So it ended up being a very strident debate over 2 hours about a bird, and it was acrimonious on the floor of the House. You would have seen it had you watched that debate, and I think that there's a better way to develop positive public policy considering all the citizens of the state, instead of making those policies that will really truly injure a significant group of people.
Matt, did you want to comment for me, or was that enough?
Well, Mark, you've lived in a rural setting your whole life. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, a little bit. First of all, I think Elway's false predictions he probably would like to forget. While I would like to see Dino Rossi as a congressman, I would probably, no secret, I didn't support the carbon tax. So he botched those two high-profile races as bad as any botch I've seen. But on the civility part, I think you and Nick have brought up, and I don't know there's a formal process of how you do it. I think what we do best is when we are forced to cooperate, 2011, when we were still in the recession and taxes were not an option because of 2/3 for all practical purposes, when we had to pass a transportation package that was going to happen, that when you get to those big issues, is it going to be culverts in the future? I don't know what it'll be, that you really find yourself that you have to work together at that point to solve a big problem. And that's when we seem to do our best work, unfortunately. When you go back to forests and fish, that was pretty controversial. RMAPs, transportation packages, and of course when 2/3 on taxes limited that option, you're forced to get together. And I can honestly say, the person I had to work with that biennium is not liked in my caucus, but him and I still get along pretty good. So maybe it takes those crises that require it. What the magic formula is, I don't know.
My question's about, it's really student specific, it's about open educational resources. Over the last couple of sessions, Representative Stambaugh has been working really hard on those. And she's leaving the House. So I was wondering if that work is going to continue, if there are going to be more pushes to expand open educational resources and reduce the cost of textbooks.
I hope there's a new champion arises. Clearly, that's a cost driver. I hope a new champion comes from within the ranks of the House or Senate.
Yeah, in the back.
Hi, so my name is Tristan. I'm 19. I'm just a student here. So a few years ago.
Not just a student.
Yeah. Back in 2014, Initiative 594 passed, and most recently 1639, which amended our firearms laws. With 594 specifically, it was with pistols, and most recently it's just semi-automatic rifles in general. I was wondering if you would consider proposing an amendment to the law to remove the permanent health privacy waiver, because currently as the law stands, when you go to purchase certain kinds of firearms, your health records are waived permanently to the government, and you have no privacy after the fact.
I think that both initiatives have areas that they could be improved upon. There's several, and if you took both of those initiatives literally, we'd be locking up a lot of people. I mean, I think they could both use fine tuning.
I hope that there's some tests in the court on that particular provision of the, because I don't believe that that would stand a test.
So would you propose any amendments to remove that portion of the law? Or?
The way initiatives work in the first 2 years, you have to have a.
594 is passed.
Oh, okay, that's right.
No, I'm very open to it because there are issues of privacy, and once legitimate concerns are over, getting your rights back, your privacy is important. This gentleman's really been working hard.
Well, we try to limit his questions.
I only have one question. Thank you so much for coming. My representative in the 26th District, Michelle Collier, will be introducing a bill this legislative session to ban access to pornography in state public libraries. If that bill got passed on the floor and it's debated, would you support or oppose that bill?
Well, we've been down this road before, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And it usually ends up being turned down. As a parent, a grandparent, and a person of faith, I would vote for it. But I think the path forward is probably pretty rocky in the courts.
Yeah, I really think that our institutions should be able to have some decency controls, and as we talk about other things where civil society has decency controls in terms of sexual harassment and all of those other issues that are really difficult to thread the needle, I think there again, I think that our public spaces should have some ability to control decency, and so obviously we live in a wired world, and so having some controls at a public space like that should be prudent and wise. And unfortunately, our public policy at this point in this juncture has a lot of conflicts on that issue. I think as a society, I think it needs to be bottom up. The public needs to say, this is the kind of society we would like to live in. And these are the decency, rules, and civility that we would like to live within.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm a returning student. I came from the railroad. I got disabled on the job a couple of years ago and have been really, really struggling. I got my long-term disability cut in March for no reason, and I'm on my second appeal for that. And I've been applying through the state for assistance and jumping through a ton of hoops to only get $190 a month, which absolutely no one can live on. Is there any discussion about things like basic income, guaranteed basic income, or some sort of social safety net for people that are, have been responsible all their lives and then just suddenly became disabled through no fault of their own?
There was a program created just prior to the recession that was never funded. Recession came, McClary came, and it never moved forward. There's federal SSI, L&I has theirs, and then they transition. But that's the history of what we've seen in Olympia.
So no, nothing on the horizon.
I haven't seen the proposals yet.
Well, it simply wasn't funded because, you had a recession and you had this little McClary thing to dig out of, and so a whole bunch of pent-up demands have been on hold for a while.
Yeah.
So I'm an international student doing a PhD in electrical engineering. So Representative Murray, you touched on the energy policy. I just had a few questions. What does the Washington State energy policy look like in the future? You mentioned that it's 85% hydro. But if you're going to move away from carbon further, how is that going to be achieved? And what does the environmental policy of Washington State look like in contrast to President Trump's policies, who pulled out of the climate accord?
Right. So as Paris Burns, I'll try to answer this question. Right now, the policies that we adopted through an initiative that do not count hydro as a renewable resource. So that's a flaw in an initiative that we lived under. So then we have these mandates. The other thing I think that's interesting with Paris is that 40% of the energy produced in France was nuclear, so it was carbon free. And then their largest carbon emitters were then the transportation fleet. And so as Macron tried to reduce dependence on petroleum and move to transit, it impacted rural communities. The rural communities have rose up, and now they're protesting, and now they're expanding their protest to a broad menu of complaints. And so that's kind of the lay that I look like. Washington State is going to be similar because we have 85% hydro, 6% nuclear. The remainder of the portfolio is natural gas, and then a small piece of coal from the coal strip in Montana. That will be grandfathered out completely very shortly. I'm not sure exactly the timeline, a year or two at the most. And so we're looking at a really probably one of the least carbon footprints of any state. And the thing about our hydro that we need to recall is that we export hydro capacity to 13 western states that are more dependent on carbon generation than we are. And so we're actually benefiting the entire western grid by our hydro production. I think that needs to be acknowledged, and we need to take a broader look. Macron's impact on global carbon, their total carbon output was 0.4% of the total carbon emitted globally, and the increased carbon free in the transportation would benefit globally 0.01% of the carbon reduction. So we're in the same position in our state, being such a low carbon generation state, that reductions will be much more nominal in terms of global carbon. So I think that having that conversation and targeting the biggest bang for your buck would be more beneficial than taking a big chunk of our economy in changing our energy portfolio to electrification of our transportation fleet, taxes with no earmarks specifically to how that impacts carbon. I just don't think that the policy proposals to get to a petroleum-free state or something like that is going to be impactful overall in global carbon. I think that we can hold ourselves up as leaders in the space of carbon-free energy. I think we need to talk about some of the hypocrisies within our system in not considering our hydro as being our best asset.
Okay, I think unfortunately our time is up. Let me thank all of you for coming out today, and let me once again take time to thank our legislators for spending time and graciously taking their time every year to come and meet with us.